Today, I'm going to be talking about an epidemic worse than COVID, and that is obesity in the United States. When you look at the people who are overweight, people who are obese, and people who are morbidly obese, it gets close to 70% of the population. Just look around. Even at the gym, you see people who are overweight. Same thing is happening with adolescents, higher than it's ever been in the history of our country. So what's going on? You know about the junk food and you know about working out, you know all of that. And yet it's not enough. You work out and you eat the right food and continue to be obese, or you go into a yo-yo effect. You lose the weight, you gain the weight. And the problem is that it's being addressed from the sense of putting out the fire rather than looking at the cause of the fire. And the cause of the fire is a misplaced desire into the wrong pleasure or into excessive pleasure. And how does that happen? Because rituals are necessary, healthy rituals are necessary in order to find joy, to find pleasure in your life. If you're living a life where you are actually adjusting yourself to the circumstances at work, to the circumstances at home, and you're not able to have power over that change that you want, then what happens is you will look for pleasure in the wrong places. Food will become your pleasure. So you might think, well, you love food too much. You don't love food too much. You need food. You never abuse what you love. You abuse what you need. So what can we do about it? First, the rituals are important. And here's what I talk about: hedonic and eudaimonic pleasure from Aristotle. Hedonic is pleasure for the sake of pleasure. The epitome of pleasure for the sake of pleasure is drug addiction or compulsions with food. That is the pleasure. Eudaimonic, which is not demons, it's good, daimon, spirit in Greek, good spirit or meaning with the pleasure in that you're getting into. So, if you change your mindset, because the problem is not hormonal. There's some people who have hormonal problems, but that's a very, very small minority of people. It is foodmonal, not hormonal, the food, and the pleasure that you put into the food. But it's the pleasure in the wrong places. If you go eudaimonic, which means then it's Aristotelian, it means that pleasure with meaning, service, and purpose, then what will happen is that you look for the rituals that we've had for over 150,000 years. Dining with family, going for walks, finding meaning in your work, finding service that has pleasure for you. And I don't mean caretaking, I mean the pleasure even inspiring someone or making someone feel good about themselves. That kind of service has immunological value, and then it balances your need for pleasure. If you have a balance for pleasure, or if you have a balance of pleasure where it's displaced, then food will become food. Food will become one of the pleasures, not the pleasure. So you have excessive attention given to one source of pleasure, and then the others are not being met. So existentially, there's a hunger that can't be fed with food, but we feed it with food. It's a hunger of meaning. It's a hunger of purpose. And it's a hunger of service. So it's not easy, but what you can do is you can begin to look at what are the rituals, and you can read my books and find out about the rituals and all that, but what are the rituals in your life that actually bring you pleasure, that have to do with other people and the kindness with yourself and things like that. And then find out how much you're depriving yourself of those things. And then when it comes to food, you tend to overdo it and overeat it. So even if you eat the right food and you don't work this hologram, because it's a hologram that you create, you will not keep the weight off. And an example of a hologram, when we have an extension of our image, mind-body image. And so I've worked quite a bit with weight management and bulimia, anorexia, all of the disorder. And you find that when people lose significant amount of weight, let's say before they had to go sideways to get into a place because of their obesity, and they lose the weight, they tend to want to go sideways again because a hologram is still there. The extension of self is still there in a hologram. And what changes the hologram is the things that we're talking about here, not the external eating or not eating, but finding meaning in your pleasure, finding purpose in your pleasure, and finding service in your pleasure, eudaimonia. Gradually begin to do that, and you will see how the food will become just food, and become aware of what you're eating, and do all the things that exercise and eating well, and cutting back on the fats, especially the bad fats. That that. But that doesn't change the hologram. That's necessary but not sufficient, because what's needed is a consciousness shift where you have a balance of where you spread your pleasure, where the sources of pleasure. Food becomes only one. If the others are not met, then food becomes the pleasure, and it tends to be abused, and it tends to be used as a way of dealing with your depression, dealing with your anxiety, dealing with your anger, and it becomes a cure-all. Of course, it doesn't cure anything, it just makes you have more real estate. So the problem is a consciousness of how you interact with food. And the nourishment is not only in the food, the nourishment is in the pleasure with service, with meaning, and with purpose. So be aware, become conscious of what's going on, and then you'll learn to love food, and you won't abuse it because you don't abuse what you love. These are concepts that need to be implemented into behavior, of course. But it's very important to see that it's not the food, it's the interpretation that we give the food and the value that we give the food. And by the way, when you're eating with that kind of hedonic pleasure, you're not even tasting the food. It's automatic because it's not a nutritional thing. It's an excessive, dysfunctional behavior. So food is not an addiction, by the way, it's a compulsion, not an addiction. And addiction is not an illness, and compulsion is not an illness. These are ways that we deal. Of course, there's neurochemistry and all that. We know all of that. But there's more than that. It's how we deal with the world and the interpretations that we make of the world and the value that we give to the interpretations that we make of the world. So, learn from hedonic to eudaimonic, and you will see what will happen. Write me about it and let me know. You will find that you'll be able to make significant change, but then don't be afraid because your body has to adjust the hologram. Gradually let it happen and gradually accept yourself for who you are. You weren't born overweight. You learn to be overweight. And some people have more propensities, and that's understandable. And there are some hormonal problems and everything, but that's not the main problem for the general population. So learn. Get rid of the excess real estate. It has no value. You have the value, not the protection that you create with the excessive real estate, because the pleasure has not been shared in the different places where it needs to be shared. So enjoy and get out of the foodmonal problem. It's not hormonal, foodmonal. Enjoy.